Welcome to The Green Urbanist, the podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. This is episode number 10, which feels a bit like a milestone. And, I started the podcast 4 months ago, a bit less than 4 months ago, and I've had such a good response. So thank you to everyone who has been listening and has given me feedback. It's really great. And thank you to everyone who's been a guest and shared their experience and knowledge with us. I've got some great guests coming up over the next few weeks. And if you think you have a message or a topic you'd like to discuss on the podcast, or if you have a recommendation for a podcast guest, please get in touch with me on Twitter or Instagram, or you can email me at greenurbanistpod@gmail.com. So today's episode is a conversation with Justin Hunt. Justin is a Canadian engineer and entrepreneur and CEO of an exciting company called Blaise Transit. Blaise is an AI-based software platform that allows transit operators to run on-demand bus services using their existing vehicles. What does that mean? Well, essentially, instead of running a traditional bus route on a fixed line, passengers can open a smartphone app and request to be picked up. The bus will then alter its route to pick up passengers on the most convenient and efficient route. You may be thinking that this sounds crazy, but Justin explains how using this demand-driven system makes it possible to provide bus services in areas where traditional bus routes don't get enough ridership and don't provide people with a good alternative to using the private car. It can also save money for bus operators because you have less empty buses on the roads. The discussion also goes more broadly into the wider field of future of mobility, how technology is revolutionizing movement and how we can leverage this to make cities more sustainable while also offering a better service for passengers and serving more members of society. We talk about some pretty nerdy stuff, but don't worry, you don't need a degree in computer science to follow along. A lot of these topics are fairly new to me as well, and Justin explains them in a very clear, jargon-free way. It's a fascinating conversation, and if you want to learn more about Blaise, you can go to their website and check them out on social media. You can also, of course, follow this podcast on Instagram and Twitter. Links for all of those are in the show description. So please enjoy my conversation with Justin. Hi, Justin. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Ross. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Where are you calling in from?
So I'm calling in from Montreal, Canada.
Fantastic.
Right now.
Is that your hometown?
Yeah, it's my hometown. I grew up in the suburbs of Montreal, and it's where my company is based at the moment.
Maybe we can start to talk a little bit more about your background and about Blaise Transit itself. You can tell us a bit about yourself and a bit about the company.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll go back to where it all started, which is really in the suburbs of Montreal. Since I studied, I did my studies at McGill University here, and it's a great university. And one of the reasons I decided to stay local, but that meant I kept living with my parents in the suburbs, which is not very far from the downtown core, but to get there by public transit is quite the adventure. And so I always had a very much a love-hate relationship with public transit, in the sense that I believed very much that it was our social and environmental duty to use public transit where available, where possible. But at the same time, I was so continuously frustrated with the lack of frequency, with the unreliability, or with the sheer fact that I was using public transit to be more sustainable, yet for the last 20 minutes of my commute most days, I was sitting by myself on this empty 12-meter diesel bus, getting chauffeured around the suburbs of Montreal. And so towards the end of my education, and by the way, I did not study transportation or urban planning or anything like that. I studied engineering and learning how to basically use technology to solve large issues. That's the way that I kind of see engineering. Okay. And so towards the end of my degree, I thought to myself, well, we're in the 21st century, and it's hard to believe that there's still such a lack of optimization and a lack of reliability and flexibility when it comes to public transportation. when there's all this technology around us and all these other services that are popping up, competing now with public transit, yet somehow we've stayed a little bit behind the times when it comes to public transport operations. So that's and then, like I said, I didn't have a formal educational background in public transit. It was just an area I was always very passionate about, learning about new concepts. Really the idea of Blaise came to me when I was, sitting on the bus at one point, and I thought to myself, what if we just ask people where they want to go in advance and plan the operations around this, instead of always basing ourselves on kind of what's been done in the past. We're now looking forward at where people want to go, so that we can really start to balance its supply and demand. We don't have these empty buses on the road, and we don't have buses that are arriving late because they picked up way more people than they anticipated, and things of this sort. That's how Blaise was founded, around that concept. And what it materialized as, what our solution is an on-demand public bus software platform. So what this basically means is that users can input their trip requests or the ride requests in advance, and we create brand new bus routes and schedules for our partner transit agencies to follow with their existing fleets and stop networks.
So, I think you're totally right about this idea that buses have basically been the same since, for the past 100 years or whatever, since the first buses were invented. It's basically like you decide a route and you set a timetable, and then people buy tickets and they can take the route. And it's amazing that over this time our lifestyles have changed so much, and yet we're still trying to get people to sort of use this very rigid system.
Absolutely, and if you don't mind me interjecting, that's actually how we came up with a name for Blaise Transit. It's named after Blaise Pascal, who's credited with inventing the first concept of public transit in 1662. So that was roughly, was it 358 years ago now? And so we've, and his was a large horse carriage in Paris that would go along a fixed kind of loop and fixed schedule that would pick up people and bring them to wherever they need to go. And so that's how we used to pitch Blaise, actually, was referencing Blaise, because really, the operations or the fixed routes and fixed schedules haven't really changed much since then. And despite making huge advances in, now we have combustion powered vehicles and GPS and all this connectivity, and yet we're still doing the same things as Monsieur Pascal. So I think that's what's super interesting, is that things have been relatively unchanged, and it hasn't caused as many problems as it does today, because I think that in the past, if you didn't have a vehicle, public transit was your only option. But now, as we know, that's not your only option. There's a wide variety of transportation services that are available now, competing with public transit. And that's something that we need to really reflect upon, and what is best from a sustainability perspective and from kind of a social perspective as well. But I think what's also super interesting, what you said, is that we would kind of install these fixed routes and expect people to just basically adapt to them and buy tickets to use them. Where, what we're proposing is the complete opposite, where people tell us where they want to go and we build it around them. So we're adapting the system to the individual needs of the passengers, instead of asking them to adapt themselves to the transit system.
It could actually, I'm just thinking off the top of my head now, it could have interesting an interesting impact on how we think about, urbanists call it transit oriented development, which is that you will plan developments which are supported by public transport, maybe buses, but also tram lines or light rail, that kind of thing. Whereas now, if you don't have this central hub like a bus stop or a station, maybe that idea becomes a little bit more dispersed, because now you can, it as you said, it's on demand. The routes will change all the time depending on who needs the bus. It's a very interesting way of switching it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with trams and with more kind of fixed infrastructure, where you obviously cannot, if you have a new subway or metro system or tram or light rail, you cannot change that route so
Yeah.
easily once it's been installed. Um, so I think with there's you can obviously have variable schedules, but I think that urban planners and designers should be looking ahead, and I know they do look ahead, many decades into the future, and where they predict how they predict the population is going to change, or the population spread and density is going to change around those areas, and making sure that something is that's going to survive the test of time is put in place. But certainly we know that there's so many variables that go into those models, that things can change so rapidly, as we have seen very recently. That what was relevant, for a tram 60 or 70 years ago may not be relevant today. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. I mean, I was just having a conversation earlier today with with a client, a local authority in England, a sort of small to medium sized city, and they were saying that they don't have control over any of their bus services. All their bus networks are run by private companies,
Mhm.
and it's been like that for many years. And so they would love to have lots more routes to serve people who aren't getting bus service at the moment, but they just can't. They just have no authority over that. Um, and of course, if you're a private company, you're not going to operate a route that it operates on a loss.
Yeah.
And so which we wouldn't expect them to. Whereas I can totally see this the Blaise Transit system becoming a way to make let's say if you had a fixed route that was just not getting enough ridership, you could put in this sort of Blaze system where you could still serve people who are in that general area, but just in a much more efficient way.
Exactly, that's the whole idea behind it, and it's a win-win situation for both the authority, the bus operator, and the users, where there are going to be there would never be a situation where there would be an empty bus circulating
Yeah.
in a town or a city, because of the fact that we're only going to where people need transportation services, and we're always following the shortest path in between each of those to get people to where they need to go. And so we've done several analyses of cities ranging from very small towns to larger mid-sized cities, and it's surprising even for us to see how much money they could be saving by just optimizing
Mm.
their lines around where people want to go. And we have a lot of examples that we often point to when speaking to new cities about how if their existing trips had been ran in on demand, we could serve close to 100% of all the trips that they would be required, but with up to a third less resources and a third
Wow.
less time that vehicles are spending on the road, and paying for drivers and gas and all of this. And then at the same time, the routes are also, or the trips for the passengers are also becoming significantly shorter. So I think that it's in the best interest of operators who are trying to optimize costs, and transit authorities who are trying to expand coverage and focus on more kind of accessibility, than the way it's currently set up. And I think there's also another issue that you hinted on there, which is often how these agreements are set up between the operators and the authority or the cities, where they have in place these long contracts that could be 3 years, 5 years long, where the operators put in place, and they're mandated to fulfill certain fixed bus lines for the next 5 years. So
Mm.
that means the city or municipality cannot change very much because it's been set in place, and the operators getting paid to serve these bus lines with these resources. And so if, say, demand drops way lower in an area, well, the city can't just say after a year or two, okay, let's just remove this bus line and save us some money if no one's using it, and reallocate these resources to another bus line. They don't have often that flexibility. So that's kind of
It's a
another
great point.
problem with how these are put in place. And so we often encourage our partners, cities that we're in touch with, to include provisions to allow this sort of flexibility. And many actually who have put in place on-demand services end up going with a separate private operator for the on-demand service compared to the one that they're using for the fixed service. So there's definitely
Mm.
some work to be done in that area as well.
So it could play a complementary role. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you want to, if a small town or actually any size city wants to expand coverage, but doesn't necessarily want to put in a whole other fixed bus line, they could expand coverage with an on-demand service only, where they say, okay, we're going to service this whole kind of, large suburb that didn't previously have any access to public transit, but it's just going to be on demand.
Mm.
And we propose the same things. There's many, surprisingly, there's many small cities that still do not have any sort of transit system. And so
Yeah.
when they look to actually putting them in place, they're now kind of leapfrogging over the fixed service, and they're going straight to on demand, which I find super, super interesting as well. So it's not, it could be complementary, it could replace service, or anything kind of in between.
Yeah, that makes total sense. In terms of, do you need a certain density of population to make this work?
So the answer to that question is no, it doesn't. It works in all contexts, but it depends on the objective. So in
Okay.
smaller towns where the density is quite low, the transit authority with a platform like ours will be able to actually say that they don't mind if there's one person per vehicle. Our objective is just to serve kind of
Mm.
as wide range of a geographic area as possible. And so we're going to set the minimum load capacity to one. So that means even if there's one person that wants to ride at 3 o'clock in the morning, we're going to serve them no matter what.
Okay.
Versus with other transit authorities that know they do get much higher ridership typically, they can set that capacity limit to be a little bit higher so that we ensure we're creating routes where we're filling up the vehicles with at least say 5 or 10 passengers. So that may end up giving creating more kind of efficient operations where it doesn't really make sense to have just one person per vehicle.
Sure.
So that's, I don't know if that quite answers the question, but it's really up to the transit authority. But we've seen it work in mega cities on demand transit, like
Mm.
Singapore and places like this, and we've seen it work in obviously extremely small rural areas with populations of 10,000 people.
Well, maybe that's a good segue to the question of, has this been done before? And what is it about Blaze that is different about you? That's different to what's been done before.
Yeah, so when I thought I came up with the idea for on-demand transit, I was sadly mistaken. That's often a thing in entrepreneurship is that you come up with an idea and then you go and do a bit of research and you found out 10 other people have had the same idea, and so we're not alone in this space, which often I does not worry me too much because it's still very much at the beginning of this transition towards on-demand, and it's quite a large market. But yeah, there's been dozens of examples across the world. One of the first was actually in Helsinki. They ran on-demand transit with a mobile app in 2012. So they started running this with smaller vans from 2012 to 2015, and the service was widely successful.
Okay.
It was shut down in 2015 from it was a kind of a policy decision, and they had invested unfortunately a lot into a new fleet of vehicles, which made the cost per ride seem extremely elevated
Mm.
compared to the other fixed services. But they're definitely kind of they started this trend in the developed world towards on-demand transportation. But now you see it in all sorts of cities. I know there's at least a dozen in Canada that have put in place on-demand transit systems. There's several across the U.S., across Asia as well. But in each of these cities, usually they've come up with their own app. They've either had it developed by an independent contractor, they've built it themselves, or they work with one of our competitors who do often a lot of customization to build unique kind of solutions for each transit operator or transit authority. And so this is where we saw a huge kind of gap in the market where we thought, well, what if there was a solution that was flexible enough to work for the needs of any type of transit authority
Mm.
on the planet and in any geography with any sort of resource constraints. So something that was a lot more universal and customizable, but by the transit authority without having us to have our team of developers customize it for each one. And so this was really us thinking about how we can scale on-demand transit and get it out there to as many cities as possible without necessarily reinventing the wheel with each time, which is often what we see with our competitors. So it causes a lot of technical challenges. Is, how do we have something that works for, I don't know, what's a small town in the UK that you could name, but
Let's say Derby, my favorite Midland city.
yeah, exactly. So comparing that to to a New York or a London, for example. So we wanted
Yeah.
an on-demand transit solution that could work in either of those, and obviously the like how the drivers are scheduled, how the vehicles are scheduled, the size of the fleet, the how the algorithms need to, it's quite a complex optimization problem. So if we're
Mm,
talking about 100 rides per hour in a small town versus 10,000 rides per hour in a mega city, it's
mm,
quite a different technical challenge to solve. So that was the approach that we took, where they could adopt our technology. They pay per month, but it's all customizable and adaptable by them. And if one day they decide we want to, I don't know, have it run as a bus stop to bus stop service, which is what we usually propose, but then the next day they say that's not working for us, let's switch it to a door-to-door service where it's going
mm.
to pick up people in front of their houses. They can just basically flick a switch and the whole system is adapted to what they need. Or if they
Wow.
want to change the rules of operation, things like that. Um, Another unique difference is that we've really focused on using the existing infrastructure and that's available. So we would never go into a city and propose using another fleet of vehicles. Typically, on demand is most interesting outside of peak hours. And outside of
Mm,
peak hours, there's dozens, and depending on the city, sometimes hundreds of vehicles available sitting in parking garages or parking lots
right.
outside of the city. And so our question is always, why would you go ahead and either rent or purchase new vehicles when you have an existing fleet that's sitting there ready to be used? And so again, it's a lot more challenging to do this with 12-meter buses that can hold up to 40 or 50 people. A lot more difficult than fitting them inside like taxis or vans that can fit up to 12. But at the same time, it makes it a lot quicker and easier for the
Yeah.
operators to adopt if all they have to do is install our tablets and hit play basically. So that's a key difference as well from how we've been able to distinguish ourselves.
That's fascinating. So it takes away that first big hurdle, which is the cost of entry. And I also love the idea of, I mean, whenever I take an Uber, which I guess is a it was probably maybe the first of these, mobility on demand
Yeah.
kind of apps, which is obviously scaled up globally. Whenever I take an Uber, I do feel slightly guilty about adding another car to the road. So I love the idea of opening an app and getting a bus to my door instead, and
Yeah,
jumping on that,
exactly.
when it's
Yeah.
when I need to. Um,
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of these sort of other companies, this is you're sort of part of this big umbrella of initiatives that's starting that you could call future of mobility.
Yeah.
So that's a term I've heard a lot recently. Can you just explain a bit about what that is?
So to me, the future of mobility is basically the application of technology to modernize and in many cases revolutionize how we move people and objects. I
Mm,
think that's the largest kind of umbrella way to describe what's happening. But it ranges from anything from electric vehicles to ride-hailing apps like Uber and car sharing to smart traffic signals and 5G communications and pretty much everything in between.
okay.
Um, so I think it's quite interesting this industry. A lot of what we see is it's adopting technology that's already been developed or applying it in a unique way to basically improve the efficiency and user experience of transportation services. Just like us, I mean, yes, we're doing some innovative things with our route optimization algorithms, but it's technology that's already there. We're using
Right.
tablets to give drivers navigation instructions. We're using we're using GPS and from people's smartphones and location services, which have existed for, the past 15 years. So it's nothing that's really new. It's just applying it all in this really unique way, in this unique formula to make transportation better. And so that's often how I see a lot of these kind of future mobility projects or initiatives unfolding.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's very exciting. I mean, we were one of the biggest um, changes I've seen in London in the last few years is the appearance of maybe in like 2018 we saw all the Chinese bike companies that were
Mm.
dropping bikes all over the city, many of
Yeah,
which got hit with fines from the local authority because they were blocking, blocking the
right.
pavement without a permit, which I thought was quite funny. Um, but yeah, we saw this wave of companies coming in. And then after a few months, they all disappeared. And I think there's like one or two left around. So there seems to be this huge wave of innovation happening, but not obviously not all the companies maybe have their business model figured out, because we've seen a lot of these. Particularly, I'm thinking particularly of the bikes, the sharing bikes
Yeah.
have sort of disappeared. Um, so, but it's not just. So we've got sort of the bike sharing, we've got the sort of on-demand transit, we've got sort of Uber. What else is there in sort of happening?
Well, I think that the combination of all of those is something that's really big in this space, which is often defined as mobility as a service,
Oh, okay.
which is kind of one kind of unified platform where you can plan out your commute across many of these different services. So I don't know if you've heard of a better definition than from describing mobility as a service, but if you're trying to plan out how to get from A to B, it could propose that you start with a bike sharing to get to a train terminal, and then you end off, with an Uber trip to get you to that last mile of your
Mm,
commute, and all of that is paid for through one central platform. It's all planned through one central platform as well, and with one global ticket, of course. So I think that's super, one thing that's super interesting. But the reality is that we have, with all of these, we're also collecting massive and massive amounts of data. And we
mm,
see that in the public transit space, where transit authorities, they're um, they are doing a lot of things that are they're innovative, but they have so much data. They have access to so much data on how people move around their cities, but they often don't utilize it and don't often know how or have the capacity to utilize it in a very efficient way.
yeah.
And so that's where we can actually come in and run some analysis. But there's dozens of other firms out there working on this, because they have data that goes back decades, where where people are getting on buses, off trams and subways on, and so this is something that I think will have perhaps the most profound impact, because it's kind of doing what we're trying to do, where it's looking at what's happening and then making decisions or making real-time adjustments based on this incoming data, and then with machine learning and artificial intelligence, you can use this data to start to predict well into the future, what
Right.
what may happen. So what ridership is going to look like, how transportations are going to evolve, based on changes in the population and things of this nature.
Yeah, I mean, I totally empathize with that. This thing that we have access to so much data, and it's just a question of what do I actually do with it. I do a lot of work around GIS, less to do with transport, but more to do with just the spatial structure of cities. And I have this issue as well, is that now there's so much data available online that is kind of
Yeah.
open source, and I get into a frenzy of downloading data sets, and then I sort of have them in front of me, and I think, what do I do with all this now? Like, what's the value of this? And so maybe it takes someone like you or someone in this space to actually look at everything that's there and figure out a unique way of combining it, or filtering it to sort of
Exactly.
create something new.
Exactly, and just the we often sometimes look at the New York City taxi data set, which has, I don't know, my numbers may be a little bit outdated, but around 110 million rows of trips that were taken, and So you can go and is often kind of a place where people working on machine learning projects in transportation, they'll go and download this data set and work with this one because it's just so much data. But you're right, is that what do we do with it? How do we utilize it and also overlap them to make sense of what's currently going on? For example, in our space, we often have access to smart card data, so we know where people tap their smart card to get on the bus. But then there's also the automatic passenger counters. So I don't know if your listeners know this, but every time there's often motion sensors on the doors of buses to track the flow of people getting on and off buses.
Okay.
But we don't know who they are necessarily. So those need to be overlaid then with the smart card data to actually figure out, or estimate where people are getting on and off. And then you have things like survey data that's done for people, origin destination survey data, or location service data that you can buy from telecommunications companies. And so how do you kind of use all of these in conjunction to actually get a clear picture of what's going on, and never mind that, but then figure out where should we go down the road. So I can understand, I mean, transit operators, city officials, they're not experts. Even a lot of urban planning companies, are not, they're not the experts in big data.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so I think there needs to be a lot of collaboration between different experts to make the best use of it, because it's really an untapped resource from what we've seen.
Well, it's such a new field as well, big data.
Exactly.
I think it, and I think probably universities, are catching up to it, but they're still working on the system that, planning and urban design is something that's done with a pen and paper and a scale ruler and everything. So I would love to see. I mean, maybe that's like if you're a young urbanist listening, that could be your superpower in your career, is to combine planning with smart data or with big data.
Yeah, absolutely. We're working actually with we have a few academic partnerships here in Canada with groups in operations research and transportation planning that are trying to use big data in fields like ours. So I think we're getting there. Just need to be patient.
So I have some notes of things that we want to speak about, and there's one thing here that I have no idea what it means, which is V2X communication.
Yeah, so V2X is vehicle to everything communication, and so there's often V2V, which is vehicle to vehicle, and then there's V2I, which is vehicle to infrastructure, so connecting vehicles to things like, to traffic signals, like traffic lights and things like that, to send information back and forth from one another. And then V2X is basically vehicle to everything. And so that's quite interesting, because you can actually have, and this is very much in the realm of kind of 5G communication, because such large amounts of data can be passed so quickly from one point to the next. But you can be passing, vehicle information about how fast you're moving, about how many people are in a vehicle, things like that, to traffic signals, to other vehicles, to really anything, to mobile phones that are on the road, so that you can start communicating between those objects and optimizing between them. And there's, a wide variety of applications between telling, vehicles that are further behind in the traffic flow, kind of what the traffic will be in a few minutes, so that you can better plan routes and things of this sort. So how we use Waze basically right now to self-declare if there's construction, if you're stuck in traffic, if there's a cop on the road. But now this would, with 5G, this could allow it to happen automatically and instantaneously, if all of these devices are now connected. So it's an area that I'm interested in. I think we'll eventually get into at Blaise, and how we can really send information between our network, but of buses that are running on demand. But I think it's definitely a space that's going to really have the potential to revolutionize transportation in the future as well.
So something this reminds me of is autonomous vehicles, which definitely, obviously need to communicate with other vehicles and with their surroundings.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So how do you basically send, imagine you have someone that's that's about to cross the street, or for example, and then you can actually communicate directly with the smartphone that's in their pocket with the antennas that are on the vehicle to let them know that they're headed to cross the street. But there's all sorts of applications of it. Definitely the autonomous vehicle industry is making good use of this, from my knowledge.
Right, right. I mean, we're seeing the sort of early developments with Tesla, and I know there's different companies testing the sort of autonomous vehicle technology. Still, I
Hmm.
I I was reading earlier today. Um, so there's this classic thing that there's 5 stages of automation, and someone made a
Right.
comment that we say there's five, but really it feels like there's 1,000 because it's so
Hmm.
many incremental improvements in all these different technologies. To get
Exactly.
there. Do you think that's a realistic thing we're going to see in the near future?
It's a good question. I mean, at conferences and stuff, I've seen some fully autonomous buses, which have really freaked me out in some ways, but at the same time, gotten me really excited for what's to come. I'm by no means an expert in automation when it comes to um, vehicles and transportation, but what I would say is that autonomous or not, we really have to think about the environmental impact and also the impact on congestion and traffic flow of autonomous vehicles. I think that's something that's often not fully discussed in the conversation around autonomous vehicles, is how this will impact traffic models and also public transportation.
Mm,
If one of the big um, conveniences of using public transit is that you don't have to be focused on the road. You can get from A to B. It may take you a little bit longer, and you have to go wait at a bus stop. But while you're on the bus, you can be productive. You can take the time to relax, to read a book, to get some homework done. But now autonomous vehicles could allow you to sit in traffic and have that same sort of experience. And so I always love this picture that's shared on across like social media, where it shows, it has a picture of a road on one side with 50, um, uh, you know, non-autonomous vehicles, and then 50 autonomous vehicles, and it takes up the same amount of space on the road. It's basically just the same picture twice. And so,
exactly.
so it's not going to do much for reducing our congestion. There's a lot of fears that it may actually increase the amount of congestion we have in our cities. And on the environmental front as well, we talk about often many autonomous vehicles are also electric vehicles, but that doesn't have to be the case as well. So again, if people don't now mind sitting in traffic because they can get work done, watch a movie, and things like that, um, what's stopping them from doing so with their combustion vehicles? So I think that we just have to be careful in terms of how um, in terms of how we encourage people to use it, and also the message that autonomous vehicles means for some reason that it's more sustainable, because that's often something that I feel like is
Mm,
conveyed, which um, I don't think that's the case.
yeah, it's not necessarily the case, and as you said, I mean, it could actually act to reduce people taking public transport, so it could be work against us in that
Exactly.
sense.
On the contrary, what is really interesting, and hopefully I'm not revealing too many of our ideas to the future of our company, is that if with the completely autonomous vehicles where you don't need a driver whatsoever, you can now, there's talks of releasing your vehicle onto the road while you're at work and you don't need it, and it'd be going to pick up people and drop off people, kind of like Uber does, but without any driver on board.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that we can actually reduce the number of vehicles that are needed overall, because you're making use of these unused assets. Like, I think Uber makes that argument as well, that your vehicle is sitting there for like 90 something percent of the time just
Yes,
doing
yeah,
nothing, unused. And Turo as well. Turo, I don't know if you guys have that in the UK, where you can rent out your vehicle
yeah.
if you're not using it for the weekend. And so if we can actually reduce the number of vehicles that are on the road through services like this, we're now, and you can also group multiple rides so that you could fill up all 4 or 5 seats in these autonomous vehicles, fill them up with passengers that need to go to different places without actually ever purchasing their own autonomous vehicles. I think that's a super interesting
Mm.
um, area that I'm excited for, because all these vehicles will need optimization. It'll all be on demand, and hopefully our technology will be there to support these types of services.
Yeah, I think there's really interesting potential there. The thing with private vehicles is they have what you would call negative externalities, which basically
Mm,
means you owning a car causes problems for everyone else.
exactly.
So, it's causing pollution. When you're parked, it's taking up space. When there's lots of cars, that adds up to a lot of space in our cities. And but most cars are just parked and not being used for 90% of the time. Um, and also, I mean, when you really, I mean, I think it's a big aspiration for people to own their own car because of the personal freedom that comes with it. When you
Mm,
actually sit down and look at the numbers, it's a real pain to own a car because first of all, they're expensive to buy, and then to maintain, and you have to pay insurance, you have to pay for the fuel. If you really look at
exactly.
it logically, and I think more and more young people are looking at it in this way, they realize actually if I can avoid owning a car, like it has such a positive effect on my finances and the environment, and I'll probably get more physical exercise because I'm out walking, cycling, taking the bus, instead of just sitting in my car.
Exactly. And that's exactly where I came at it from, where I had access to my parents' vehicle, going back to my kind of origin story there. But I wouldn't take it for sustainability, purposes and things like that. And so the question is, if these young people are more, which they are, it's proven that they are more willing to use public transit than any generation previous to them. How can we keep public transit up to their expectations that they get with other services? So how can we be resolving a lot of these pain points that they currently have around with the reliability, the flexibility of the services, and the length of commute? And that's where we're coming in to basically try to give public transit the facelift it needs to stay competitive with what's expected from these younger generations. Something else I'd like to add too, I'm sure the stats are similar in Canada, but like you said, it's a lot of people think that the major cost of owning cars is just the initial purchase, but there's been studies here in Canada that it costs just under $10,000 on average per year to own a vehicle. So when you
Wow.
factor in like the cost of the vehicle over the lifetime, the depreciation, all the insurance, the oil, the gas, the parking, everything like that, it's insanely expensive. And another fun fact, I was recently interviewing this master's student in transportation planning that had looked at the impact of student discounts and discounts for young people across many transit authorities in Canada, and found that interestingly enough, the discounts themselves being implemented had zero impact on ridership for the age groups or for the populations um, that they were basically built to serve. And so this, to me, initially, it seems surprising, but if it's between, having a 30%, paying 30% more for public transit versus buying a vehicle and paying about $10,000 extra per year, I think a lot of people are starting to do the math and realize that, hey, regardless of this discount or not, it still makes a lot more sense for me to take public transit. That's my explanation of it anyway. It's definitely not cited anywhere in academia, um, but I think that, yeah, like you said, it's really promising to see how many young people are using it, and they're thinking not just about their the cost, but also the physical activity. If they can get more steps in that way, if they can get more fresh air that way, more work done as well. Like I mentioned, it's quite a popular place for people to either spend time reading or responding to emails, things like that, compared to
Listening to
sitting in a
podcasts.
vehicle. Yeah, listening to podcasts, exactly.
Oh yeah, I was going to say that's 10,000 Canadian dollars presumably.
Oh yes, yeah,
So
exactly.
probably between
So for
five
like
and
six
six
thousand
thousand,
pounds, yeah,
yeah, pounds sterling. Still a lot of money.
yeah,
Everything sounds a bit more dramatic in Canadian dollars to us.
yeah, exactly. Just multiply it by almost two there with our current exchange rate.
Exactly. But I think this point about future of mobility, new technology, and how that fits with sustainability, and carbon,
Mm,
zero carbon goals is really, really important one because often they're conflated. They're talked about as if they're the same thing, whereas actually, I mean, they're not necessarily, and you need to look at it a bit more closely, and think about the long term consequences. You know, if we're really innovating to make everyone, uh, much more reliant on private vehicles, even if they're electric autonomous vehicles, it still is creating problems, for our cities. And for instance, one thing that a previous podcast guest told me that I actually didn't realize, to do with air quality. So the most damaging element of air pollution for humans is particulate matter. So you probably see it written as PM10 and PM2.5. That's the size of the particles. They're absolutely microscopic, and these are the particles that are doing the most damage to your lungs, basically. And where these come from is not from burning fossil fuels; it's from materials wearing down, and so it's car tires and brake pads from cars wearing down to these microscopic particles, and then they're floating in the air.
Wow.
And so even if you move to even if all the cars in the world turned electric, that problem wouldn't go away. So that's something to really bear in mind. So really, the only way to tackle that issue is, having a large modal shift to walking, cycling, public transport, and just having less vehicles overall.
Exactly, and another aspect too is at least in Canada, or in where we're from in Quebec, we're lucky that our energy sources are from renewable energy sources like hydro. But in the U.S., there's many places where if you own an electric vehicle, it's being charged with energy that's produced by coal-fired plants, and so yes, it's electric, so it's not directly polluting, but the energy that you're drawing from the grid is actually fossil,
Yeah.
comes from fossil fuels. So it's super interesting to know. I did not know that about those particulate matter. About those particles, but yeah, I think that we need to be very conscious of the kind of negative externalities and the secondary impacts of those externalities on society, and the environment.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So we're recording this in October of 2020. We were just discussing before we hit record about our respective lockdown measures in
Yes.
Canada and the UK. I think COVID-19 has been a big hit for the public transport sector, because of course people don't want to be in close contact with other people. Um, so I mean, how do you think that's affecting the industry? Is that going to be a long-term issue?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't have a crystal ball, so if it's going to be a long-term issue, but so far, I mean, I think that we've seen many people permanently change their transportation patterns based on changes that they've had to make in their lifestyle due to COVID-19. Just last week, I saw in the news that Microsoft announced that some employees will be able to be permanently working from home. We personally don't have an office space anymore, so even if the cities do open up, there isn't even an office for our employees to go back to. Everyone's
Yes.
staying remote, and so many tech companies that don't need it to physically go in have followed suit. So I think that it's definitely reshaped how we think about how people, is it really necessary for us to move and to leave our homes to get certain things done? And then you've seen a lot of fear emerge as well with regards to public transportation, just because of the fact that people don't know if they're going to be on a bus with 40 other people and cramped like sardines, or
Mm,
if they're going to be alone and be able to socially distant. So this is why you're still seeing huge, drops in ridership, is because of the fact that there's students are working from home, vulnerable populations like older people are more reluctant to use public transit. Professionals are working from home. So again, I wish I had these stats for the UK, but in most cities that we speak to around North America, ridership is still at 50%. Even before the second wave hit, it was still at 50% of what it was before COVID hit. And so, I was asked this question, like, is it possible to maintain your current operations at 50% of ridership, which translates to 50% of the revenue that you had
yeah.
coming in before COVID? And so transit authorities now are starting to, in my opinion, blindly cut service where there's simply lower
Mm,
ridership. That's how they're saving money right now. But I think this is quite a dangerous precedent to go down towards, because you enter into what I like to think of as the transit death spiral, where ridership drops, so they decrease service. And then because of the decreased service, ridership is going to drop some more because it's less
yes.
available. And then they're going to less revenue, so they're going to decrease service some more. And this, continues on and on. And so what we always propose is, if you have the option between, removing service or just replacing service with an on-demand one, going with the latter actually allows you to maintain that same quality of service, but at a lesser cost. So I think that, and it's frightening as well, because I don't think it's going to be easy to get back these riders for people that have,
Yeah.
had to still commute. Maybe people that are essential service workers, they don't have a choice, and they don't. The service was decreased, so now they've purchased a vehicle, they've made arrangements to carpool. It's going to be very difficult to get those people back into public transit if or when this is all over. And so I think transit authorities and operators need to think very hard about the decisions that they're making, um, and really using innovation as a solution. It's In the past, it was, projects like ours and other of these future mobility ones were seen as kind of these nice side projects that made good press releases, and it was very cool and things like that to talk about, a lot of them. But now these are real solutions that can actually solve many of the challenges they're facing, due to COVID-19, because it's exposed all the flaws, not just in transit, but in our healthcare systems, our education systems as well. It's exposed so many flaws, and how we get out of these kind of unique challenges is, I think, with innovation. And so I would just encourage any planners or city officials listening to think about how they can make the best use of technology to get themselves out of these situations.
Wow, very well said. Yeah, I think there's been a huge shift now across society where the sort of idea of doing things remotely was talked about for decades. I mean,
Yeah,
back in like the 70s, people were saying like, oh, in the future, you'll never have to leave your home. Everything will be
yeah,
done. And it never really happened until a global pandemic hit, and we were forced to
forced
do it.
everyone. Yeah,
And what most people I think have realized is that actually it's everything works fine. Like you can, if you're obviously it depends what kind of work you're doing. If you're working in sort of the knowledge economy where you're working on computers and you're in contact with people, you can be in, you can just pick up the phone and talk to people. Seems to work fine. Um, Obviously, if you run a butcher's or a physical
yeah,
place, obviously they're the people who are really
need to be
suffering.
there.
And I don't mean
Yeah.
to sort of forget about that, because obviously we do need to have people still going out and using their local services, using their high street.
Exactly. And how do we create that balance as well? I mean, now, we've and I think that's what's another topic that I love to discuss is the food delivery space as well,
Mm,
with all these local merchants and the huge um, cut that services like Uber Eats are taking, up to 30% of the revenue from these, and
oh,
already the
really?
margins in the restaurant industry are so slim, and now all these people are going in just to keep their jobs and keep their restaurants afloat. Yet 30% of their revenue, which has already been hugely decreased due to COVID, is now going to these large corporations like Uber, who are providing these software services once again. So I think we really need to think of how we can protect some of these small local businesses, keep driving people towards them, maybe reorienting some transit routes so that they pass in front of these local places. Who knows? But I completely agree. I think it's in some industries it makes a lot of sense, but in others it's obviously not possible, and we still need to think about them. And actually, in Montreal, the mayor just before the second wave was encouraging people in the business district to come back to work.
Yeah.
Initially they were extremely conservative, and they had put limits that you weren't allowed more than 25% capacity in buildings, but they had gotten up to 5 or 10%. They were, they're basically
Mm.
these huge skyscrapers were empty, and so all the coffee shops, the restaurants, the local stores and boutiques around them were not seeing any clients. And so yeah, it's quite a scary time for a lot of business owners out there, and even for the ones that can go remote. I think we need to think really hard as entrepreneurs and as leaders in the business space, how we engage with our employees, and how we encourage them to think about their own mental well-being on their own, given that um, there's no disconnect between their home lives and their work lives anymore. I think it's our duty to really encourage people to go outside, to get fresh air, to go exercise, to take time with themselves, because it's so easy when you're just, your living room is right here, you're working from your kitchen, to just, continuously stay on and never shut off. But that's maybe a little bit off topic with public transit, but I think it all ties together, because things have changed. And yeah, I don't know if they will ever go back to how they were before.
You did remind
Yeah.
me of something, as we haven't talked at all about moving goods. So not just
Mm.
moving people, but also freight and delivery and things like that. Is there anything you want to add on that?
Well, I think that's another topic where technology like ours can come in handy. It's like I said, we're not reinventing the wheel, but a lot of these smaller companies do struggle to actually optimize their operations efficiently. And some, like for food delivery or for package delivery, we see sequential delivery still in 2020, which means you basically, like, if you have a driver, it picks one object up, drops it off, and then goes back, picks something up, and drops it off. And so there's none of this multi pickup, multi drop off optimization. And also, with requests coming in real time, it's really difficult if you have a whole fleet of vehicles and you have everything that's changing in real time, to basically trying to figure out what the best way
Yeah.
to redispatch all these vehicles are when they're doing multi pickup and multi drop off. And so this leads to not only a huge, extra cost that could be avoided, but also you could be serving these orders with a significantly, less with significantly less vehicles on the road.
Yeah.
And so I think they need to also be thinking about their operations and technology that they're using, to make sure that they're, serving as many people as possible with the least amount of vehicles and the least amount of time these vehicles spend on the road, if we really want to keep this industry sustainable. That's the
Mm.
only thing I'll add there. But if I could just add on as well, for something else on the public transportation side, which I find is a quite dangerous path, is that any sort of transportation is really a gateway to economic opportunity.
Right.
And so if you start reducing service, and making it difficult for people to access jobs and to access parts of the city, or stripping lines entirely so you don't have any access to public transit and you can't afford a vehicle, well, then you're so limited in terms of what you can get access to. So I think that we really need to be thinking hard about how we alter our transportation services. And the same thing applies for delivery, tying it back to that. If you have, and some of these companies will not serve outside of a certain geographic area. And so, if they can't get access to food delivery, to parcel delivery, because you're just located so far outside the city, because that's the only place that you can afford to live, you're potentially at a disadvantage just because of where you are geographically, which I don't think is the case. But to make everything more accessible, we need some level of optimization to occur.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's really just about looking at, seeing these glaring inefficiencies and saying, we can do this a better way with just a bit of technology that already exists. It's really just about getting it off the ground.
Exactly. And I mean, like, well, I don't know if I mentioned this at the beginning, but the whole concept of on-demand transit, tying it back there, has existed for a few decades for people with disabilities, where you could
Mm.
call in 24, 48 hours before and have a vehicle dispatched to your home, and it brings you to medical appointments or wherever you need to go if you need extra accessibility. But you think about that, where you need to request some time, and it still exists today. We still speak to cities where you have to call in 48 hours in advance, speak to a person. They put, two X's on a map and then hand that map to a driver 2 days later when the trip actually occurs, and they're planning things and schedules up by hand. And so like you said, I think these concepts are not brand new, but the technology that can really make all the difference, like that I think it needs to be deployed properly so that we can be serving more people with less resources.
Another point you brought up there, which I think is really important, is this idea of serving all members of society.
Hmm.
And there's almost, I mean, I don't know if you'd call it a social justice issue, but it's almost an equality issue where often in cities that have established transport networks, the areas that are best served by public transport are often the wealthiest, and there's a
Hmm.
bit of chicken and egg there because if you put in an underground line or a tram line, that will raise the property values around it, and then so
Yeah.
over time you tend to get wealthy people accumulating in close proximity to metro stations, things like that. But it is still something we need, that I think is not discussed often on the strategic level, which is, you know, are the people most in need of this transport so that they can get access to job opportunities
Hmm.
and other parts of the city. Are they being served? It's not just about the business people who have to come in and work in an office. um, it's all also about, it can be facilitative of economic regeneration as well, and should be.
Exactly. And it's not only access as well, but it's also the time that it takes for people to get access to these. So imagine someone that spends 2 hours commuting to downtown London for a minimum paying job.
Yeah.
That they could be spending up to 4 hours a day of lost economic activity just because it takes them so long to get them from A to B. So if we can be giving them time back in their day to actually work more, spend time with their families, or doing whatever they want, I think this is another huge issue that's overlooked. It's not enough to say, okay, well they do have access to anywhere in the city, but a commute that in a car takes 10 minutes takes them an hour and a half in public transit. That I would not say is very equitable or accessible, in my opinion. So yeah, I think that we really need to consider who's using it, and then how can we build a system around these users that is best adapted to their needs. I think it's as simple as that. And if it's not, then we need to change it, and change it as often as we need to. And that's where we get closer and closer to this on-demand instance.
But before I jump into the final question, is there any other topics that we haven't touched on that you want to bring up?
I mean, the concept of microtransit, which is often what we're grouped into.
Okay.
I don't know if you mind if I just jump into that and just draw some comparisons there.
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
So microtransit is a field of on-demand transit, it's a subset, but it's often defined by these smaller vehicles running door-to-door or last-mile services. And so the technology ends up being very similar, and our technology can do a lot of these microtransit use cases, but it's a whole different ballpark when you start working with the bus stop network as well, and figuring out which bus stop to send people to reduce the entire commute of passengers, and also the size of the vehicle that is used. So the cost per vehicle for most microtransit use cases is comparable to that of paratransit for people with disabilities. It's extremely high cost per trip because it's
Mm.
just not efficient to go to 12 people's doors and pick them up and then bring all 12 people to their destination. And so the way that we've designed our system is more, once again, to use these full-size buses, but to head to a network of stops. And these stops that we send people to are chosen by us, which is really interesting, because if you think wherever you are now, wherever our listeners are coming from, if you think about within a 10-minute walking radius, how many bus stops could you possibly hit? If you're located in some sort of downtown city, you could easily walk to 20 or 30 or 50 bus stops within a 10-minute walking radius. And so we decide which bus stop we send you to get picked up at, to actually reduce the overall commute. And
Right.
and so this is kind of a small but quite significant differentiator between us and microtransit. So we can do, whether, like I said, whether it be door to door, or let the user pick the bus stop, or we pick the bus stop, or a taxi or a minivan, or a 12-meter bus, and everything in between. But I think there is a right model that kind of could work for a city, and it's important to really think about, are we doing this just for the users, or also just for the cost, or is there a way that we can accommodate both? And that's kind of where we try to fit, is in that middle part where we're actually saving money, but we're still improving that user experience.
Yeah, it's that's like the ultimate win-win, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And so you get these like microtransit services, which are great for the user, because it's like you literally walk outside your door and there's a bus, or a mini bus, say, or one of those sprinter vans waiting for you. But then the cost per trip is significantly higher than the fixed bus services that are on
Right.
the road right now. And then the fixed bus service obviously has no consideration for what the user wants at that point. But the cost per trip can be quite high. And so we try to fall somewhere in the middle there, a good user experience at a lower cost per trip.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So as this podcast is about climate change for the most part, I like to ask every guest, similar question as the final question, which is, what changes would you like to see happening in the coming decades? This is quite a transitional time for action on climate change, and we have a lot of um, countries and cities who have signed up to achieving zero carbon. So we've got this huge challenge ahead of us. We seem to be mostly going in the right direction, but from your perspective, what needs to happen?
So I think we need to really rebuild a lot of these systems that we have in place um, around reality and what users actually want. And if we do this in a sustainable way, they're going to follow. And I think that's if we're expecting people to use public transportation, well, we need to change it so that it solves a lot of their biggest pain points. If we want people to use electric vehicles, we need to be solving problems, whether it be financially or access to cheap electricity, things like that. We need to really be thinking about, if we want people and businesses to change their behavior, let's give them something that's worth changing it for, and making sure that whatever that thing is more sustainable than what's currently in place.
Right.
And that's what we're trying to do with public transportation. We want to get people out of their single occupant vehicles, and ideally out, especially out of the ones which are combustion powered and are not electric, get them out of those vehicles and into shared sustainable transportation, like public transit, or even carpooling, or ride sharing, and things like this. So to do that, like I said, we're thinking about, why do people not like public transportation in the first place, which is always the reliability, the
Yeah.
frequency, and the length of commute. And we're trying to solve those. And so we're not pushing them towards public transit because it's sustainable. I think, it is. But I think our message here is that, come towards public transportation because we've made it a heck of a lot better.
Yeah.
At the same time, it is also, way more sustainable. But I think to drive behavioral change, we need to get into the minds of the people that require the changing, and realize that people are inherently, they think about themselves first. And I think that's just a quality of human nature. Not any, I'm not trying to pass judgment or anything, but I think this is something that we can use to actually affect change when it comes to environmental sustainability. So, and I think that's kind of generic enough that it can be applied to many different problems that we face.
No, that's a great answer, and it's a great perspective on it. I mean, really, it's the only way, because we're always constantly asking people to change their lifestyles and change their habits. But if we don't give them a good alternative, then how can you
Then
expect it to happen? Yeah.
exactly, and the same thing for businesses as well. Like often, and it does like work both ways. Or if you're making something more, say, fuel efficient, well, you're saving costs often in that regard. Like there's another startup we know here that has a technology to make to retrofit trucks to make them hybrid basically.
Hmm.
And so they're doing this for sustainability reasons, where they want to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of these trucks that are on the road, but it also can reduce the fuel consumption and costs of these freight companies significantly. And so that's that's how they sell it, is through
Oh
that.
yeah.
But the direct benefit is that it's reducing the negative externalities of their operations. So I think that's how we need to go about this if we really want to impact change. It's nice to think that people are going to do things just for environmental reasons, but the reality is that if we're not improving their situation, reducing their costs, making things easier for them, the chances are less likely.
Yeah, absolutely. Justin, it's been a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
Likewise, Ross, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about everything transportation and sustainability and climate change with you. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to speak with you today.
If where can people find you online, or learn more about Blaise?
Yeah, if they want to learn more about Blaise, they can go to our website at blaisetransit.com. That's BLAISE transit.com. Or look us up on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, under the name Blaise Transit.
Fantastic. Right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ross.